Hi there, welcome to the very first episode of The Logic of Risk, a podcast about risk, probability, the philosophy of uncertainty, and data science. My name is Pasquale, and I'm a professor of data science in Switzerland. If you want to find out more about me, assuming you're interested, just look me up on a search engine. You can also check out my YouTube channel, which shares the same name as these podcasts, The Logic of Risk. There, you'll find videos of some of my lectures, seminars, and other content. This new podcast is essentially an international spin-off of a podcast I already produce in Italian. So if you happen to speak Italian and you listen to this new podcast in English, you might notice a few repeated topics at first. However, I do want to turn this new experiment into something broader and more far-reaching. From time to time, we'll invite guests and discuss current events, always through the lens of risk and data science. I'm open to suggestions on specific topics, so please feel free to reach out with ideas or feedback. You can do so through the contact form on my personal website or via X, formerly known as Twitter, where my handle is at DRCIRILLO. Here on The Logic of Risk, I'd like to share what I've learned and what I continue learning about risk. My goal is to convey that risk isn't something we should automatically avoid at all costs, because without taking risks, there are no opportunities and consequently not much real life. Of course, not all risks lead to opportunities, and that's something we'll explore together in detail. I would also like to clarify certain concepts that the media often handle poorly, which in turn can cause social and political confusion. Think of the countless, often specious or misinformed debates about the risks of various diseases, technological decisions, investment choices, and so on. Or the casual comparisons that lump together entirely different types of risk. Or the many so-called black swans we see in the news, to the point that now it's the poor white swan that's the real exception. Then there are the people who confuse the concepts of mean and median and write lengthy moralistic articles based on that confusion. And there's the risk zero dream, which I'll try to show you is basically the same as the evaporation of humanity. In short, there's plenty to discuss and analyze. We'll be covering various topics. Some might not seem strictly tied to risk at first glance, but I assure you they either are or will be. Occasionally, I'll ask you to grab a pen and paper and write down a few notes to think about until the next episode. I hope you'll join me in that. Of course, it's not required in any way. I don't force my university students to do things, so I'm certainly not going to force you. I think that's enough of an introduction for our very first episode. But before we dive in, one last note. New episodes will be released weekly, and their length may vary. I'll try to keep each one under half an hour, but I already know I'll sometimes go over that. Some topics, like the history of risk, will span multiple episodes, others won't. My plan is to cover just the essential material needed to move forward. Now, let's jump into our core question, one that will guide us through many, if not all, of our future episodes. What is risk? It might seem straightforward at first, but answering that question is more complicated than you probably think. We will need quite a few conceptual tools for a formal discussion. Let's start simply. If you open a dictionary, the definition might vary slightly depending on which one you use, but we can summarize it like this. Risk is the possibility of incurring a damage or loss. Even at this basic level, you can see risk is already a compound concept. Mathematically, we often, though not always, express it as a product of multiple components. What are these components? So far, we have two: the damage something negative for me, for society, or for someone else. And the possibility that this negative event might happen or might not. Damage alone isn't enough. If I deliberately and, let's be honest, foolishly smash my hand with a hammer, it's no longer just a risk, but a certainty. At the same time, the mere possibility of an event, something contingent that isn't guaranteed, also isn't enough. For instance, there's no real risk in winning a lottery ticket someone else gave me for free. Quick side note. You'll notice that I tend to be very precise about how I use certain words, especially at the beginning, to avoid common misunderstandings. For example, I won't use uncertainty as a synonym for possibility, probability, or eventuality, because uncertainty is something quite specific that actually completes the definition of risk. We'll talk more about that in future episodes, but let's at least hint at it now. If risk is the possibility of incurring damage, then in order to address or manage that risk, we need two things. We have to be able to identify the damage, and we need to attach some measure, or at least an estimate, of the probability that this damage might occur. Therefore, risk requires some kind of quantifiability in its dimensions. What happens if we know something negative might happen, but we have no idea what the probability is, or if we can't even qualify the event, let alone quantify it? Consider this scenario. I tell you that if you turn the corner, something good or something bad will happen to you. I'm deliberately excluding the possibility that nothing happens at all. Obviously, you have no clue what's behind that corner. It could be wonderful, something you've always wished for, or it could be as trivial as a kick in the backside. Maybe you'll find $10,000 on the ground, or maybe there's a sniper waiting for you. You don't know what's there, nor do you know the likelihood of each outcome, apart from the trivial. Something will happen with probability 1, or almost surely, as we say in probability theory. This is a situation of uncertainty, not risk. When we can't quantify the damage, can't attach a probability to its occurrence, or can't do both, we call it uncertainty rather than risk. We'll see there are various nuances, gradations, if you will, of both uncertainty and risk. And it's important to realize these concepts are dynamic, not static, despite what many people assume. Let's get back to risk. The dictionary definition is a good start, but after many years working on risk, I think it can be refined. Specifically, I like to combine insights from authors like Nassim Nicholas Taleb, Gerd Gigerenzer, Daniel Kahneman, and Nicholas Riescher. We'll meet them in future episodes. For now, bear with me while I offer a definition of risk that is both theoretically sound and practically useful. The dictionary's version doesn't tell us why we might face risk, nor does it give us a helpful context for risk management strategies. From now on, when we talk about risk, we'll define it as the possibility of a negative event, that is, one that causes damage, brought about by internal and or external vulnerabilities or factors, which can potentially, at least partially, be contained or even prevented. Internal factors are often called endogenous, while external factors are exogenous. What's new here? We clarify that risk stems from something we can identify, some vulnerability or factor, so we don't blur the line with pure uncertainty. We also recognize that the causes can be internal or external. For example, if I am hit by a car while crossing the street, there might be 1,000 explanations. Maybe I was careless and didn't look both ways. Perhaps the driver was distracted, or worse, intoxicated. Maybe a tire blew out and the driver lost control. Some factors depend on me, while others do not. In general, I can more effectively address internal factors than external ones. Please notice that our definition adds that risk can potentially be contained, at least partially. This is the starting basis for risk management because we're discussing something quantifiable, whose causes we can at least partly trace, and therefore we have the hope and ambition to intervene. It may look like a simple tweak, but this definition runs deeper than it appears. In just a few lines, it raises very non-trivial issues we'll return to again and again. We noted that the damage must be quantifiable and the probability of occurrence must also be quantifiable, at least within some confidence interval. The notion of damage can be subjective. What constitutes damage depends on who's experiencing it. In decision theory and economics, for example, they use utility functions to describe this subjectivity. Losing $1,000 isn't the same for a factory worker as it is for Jeff Bezos. Breaking a femur is different for someone in their 30s than for someone in their 90s. A major earthquake has a vastly different impact in a wealthy country with robust infrastructure like Japan than it would in a very poor country where people live in huts made of mud and straw and have no earthquake preparedness. And even if in everyday speech we often treat risk as something objective, it's actually subjective. Sometimes the subject is just you or me, other times it's an entire group or society, but you can't detach risk or its perception from the individual or group that could be harmed. This, of course, influences how we manage it, if only because there are constraints, physical, monetary, psychological, and so on. On top of that, and we'll dive much deeper in upcoming episodes, the concept of probability itself can be subjective. There are different philosophical schools of probability theory. Some are more objective, like the axiomatic approach, but choosing one school over another is ironically subjective. Likewise, nothing is purely objective in estimating the probability of a risk event regardless of the theoretical approach. Just picking a particular model depends on my personal preferences and experience, on the information available to me, and so forth. That's one reason we consult experts for complex risks we're unfamiliar with. Of course, experts are people too, and they face model risk. That is the risk of being wrong in their approach. We'll come back to that as well. All this is not an elegant way of saying we cannot do anything about risk, hiding behind subjectivity. We can do a lot. I just want you to see right here in this first episode that things are more complex than the simplistic formula, potential loss times its probability. Formulas, big, small, or in between, are incredibly useful, but only when applied with an ounce of caution. We have to understand their limits, because unless we fancy ourselves omnipotent and omniscient, attitudes you might see in certain politicians or media personalities, then we do have limitations. And ironically, recognizing limitations can become a strength in risk management. It's all about knowing what they are and planning accordingly. I want to wrap up this first episode with one final observation that might seem obvious, but is actually quite important. There's a difference between risks we take on and risks we're subjected to. Risks we take on are those we choose to incur, like the so-called choice of action. We deliberately do or don't do something that creates or amplifies one or more risks. Risks we're subjected to are those that go beyond our control, such as large-scale natural disasters, pandemics, or economico-financial crises, especially if we are not in that sector. If we are, I tend to be less forgiving. Clearly, risk management differs depending on which category you face. In the first, we can play offense. In the second, we're forced to play defense. But as I've noted, risk and uncertainty are dynamic concepts, so it's totally possible and, in fact, quite common to move from one category to the other. Take the last pandemic. Initially, it was something we were all subjected to. Whether it was entirely unforeseen is a separate conversation. Spoiler alert. No at the systemic level, maybe at the individual level. Over time, however, our management of the situation shifted toward actively taking on certain risks. When it comes to actively assuming risks, there's an adage I find critical. Using Nassim Taleb's words, it's better to assume risks you can quantify than to quantify risks you've already assumed. Thank you so much for listening. If you'd like, you can share these podcasts available on all major platforms and leave a review or 5-star rating, whatever you think is fair. I hope to have you back for the next episode. Let me leave you with a quote from Sigmund Freud: "When you eliminate risk from your life, little remains." That's it for today. Thanks again, and I'll catch you in the next episode.